it changes it enormously because I grew up thinking that the ascension was about Jesus sort of going back to being God again. That's completely a misunderstanding. This is about Jesus becoming God's right-hand man because heaven is the place from which earth is run. The point is that Jesus is now sovereign. He's now in charge. That's why after the ascension, the disciples go back to Jerusalem. They're not miserable because he's gone. They're celebrating because he is now the Lord of the world.
That's N.T. Wright. He's been studying the New Testament for over 50 years. He's written close to 100 books, and he's one of the most influential scholars alive today. I'm Nate Hansen, and this is Faith Lab. The Apostle Paul said it himself in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. Christianity staked everything on one falsifiable historical event. And after spending the last couple years reading the actual scholarship on this, from Bauckham to Lacona to N.T. Wright himself, I can tell you the historical case is far stronger than I ever thought it was, and far stronger than many realize. Here's what Wright lays out.
What's your number one argument for a bodily resurrection? Because I know even within Christian tradition, there are lots of different interpretations of what kind of resurrection it might have been.
In the early tradition, the first 200 years, say, the Greek word anastasis doesn't mean a non-bodily and couldn't mean a non-bodily resurrection. It means the word means a standing up. This is somebody who was bodily dead being bodily alive again. It's only after about 200 years when some of the people that we loosely call the Gnostics got hold of the idea that they used the word to mean, if you like, my body is still moulding in the grave, but my soul goes marching on, or something like that. That is never what the word anastasis meant at the time. It always did refer to the new physical aliveness of somebody who had been bodily dead.
What are some other instances of the word being used?
Whenever people are talking about the possibility, for instance, in Aeschylus, in his play The Eumenides, when the great court of the Areopagus is being founded in Athens, Apollo himself, the god Apollo, comes on stage and says, we have to do things this way because when a man has died and his blood is spilt on the ground, there is no resurrection, oudestin anastasis. And it's clear what he means. I mean, lots of Greeks believed that after hero figures had died, their souls would go on to some other destination. But what is being specifically denied is anastasis. And the occurrences of that go on and on. And of course, when you get Judean people who are expecting the resurrection, not that it's happened yet, but they're expecting it. For instance, like in the books of the Maccabees, when they're praying for people who've been killed in battle and it says because of the resurrection. In other words, they're not raised from the dead yet, but they will be if we pray for them. There's a host of evidence for this. In some cases, like that latter one, it's when people are looking ahead to the bodily resurrection, which is in the mainstream Judaic belief of the time, as in Pharisaism.
This is a point that I overlooked for a long time. The Greek word anastasis didn't mean a soul floating away or a corpse getting restarted. It meant a bodily transformation into something new. And that distinction matters because it means the earliest Christians weren't borrowing from Greek philosophy or some pagan myth. They were claiming something that had literally no precedent. So what's the evidence that it actually happened? Wright points to something really specific.
The primary witnesses cited in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are women. In a time when we know that woman's testimony was not valid in a court of law. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that, and various other sources as well. So if you were making up these stories, even 50 years later, you certainly wouldn't have invented these women.
Scholars call that the criterion of embarrassment, and it's one of the strongest tools that historians have for testing ancient claims. But Wright points to a second line of evidence that some people haven't considered.
We know of at least a dozen messianic or prophetic movements, kingdom of God movements, if you like, in the 200 years either side of Jesus' events. And routinely they ended with the death of the founder, usually by military violence or the Romans killed them or whatever. And in no other case do we have people going around saying that that person who's just been killed was in fact Israel's Messiah, and we follow him. Now, this is a very interesting thing, because in some of those other movements, um, the person who was killed had some followers who wanted to carry on the movement, but obviously he'd been killed, so he couldn't be the leader, he couldn't be the Messiah, so they got somebody else, perhaps from the same family. We've got evidence of that happening. But the closest person in Jesus' family was James, his brother, and James was the great leader of the church in Jerusalem for the next 35, 40 years. But nobody ever thought that James was the Messiah.
Think about what that means. We have over a dozen failed messianic movements in this same period. The pattern is always the same. The leader dies, the movement dies, or it regroups around someone new. But nobody was inventing a resurrection. And yet that's exactly what the early Christians claimed. Wright says there's a third piece that makes fabrication even harder to argue.
There's lots of other ancillary evidence, like there's no evidence of any of Jesus' followers gathering to pray at his tomb or making it a memorial or anything like that, which they certainly might well have done had it been that actually he just died by crucifixion and that was it. So it's really a convergence of evidence. One more thing, that we know quite a lot about what people in the ancient world believed about life after death. We know a lot about the Greco-Roman world, we know a lot about the Egyptian world, we know a lot about the Judaic world, and there were many different views of what happened to people after they died. And the early Christians pick one of those, which is that ultimately we're waiting for bodily resurrection, even though the early Christians came from all those other different cultures that I've just mentioned. Now, beliefs about what happens after somebody dies tend to be very conservative. People lurch back in times of grief to what they know, what they were taught, what they've always believed. But all these people, to their surprise, say, we're going to be raised bodily from the dead. Well, how do you know? Well, God raised Jesus from the dead. And so the whole thing points back, something must have happened to generate this extraordinary thing of these stories, of this aftermath, of this change in focus in people's beliefs. And all the lines converge on something extremely odd and unexpected happening 3 days after Jesus' death. And if we don't want to accept that, of course, we can say, well, I don't know what's going on, but there must be some other explanation. Well, that's okay, but it just means that there is nothing wrong with that explanation, except that it's saying that that something happened for which there was no precedent and of which there is no subsequent example.
Okay, now skeptics have offered alternative explanations for centuries. Hallucinations, grief visions, cognitive dissonance, legend development. And I took those seriously for a while, and some compelled me a bit. But when you actually line them up against the data, they all have the same problem. And Wright walks us through the main ones.
One of the most interesting ones, I think, is that people realize today that often after somebody who has been valued and loved has died, that person sometimes makes an apparent appearance to somebody that they've loved. We had an instance of this in my own family where somebody died, and to everyone's surprise, he fleetingly appeared in a different house, looking very well and smiling, and then disappeared again. I know the people concerned quite well. And a friend of mine had a daughter who was killed in a random shooting in Texas, completely out of the blue. And her fiancé, who was in California, was sitting in his room, and suddenly she appeared in his room, smiling at him, and then disappeared. And he was shocked and phoned up and discovered that she'd just been murdered. I mean,
Wow.
this is a well-known phenomenon. Now, here's the thing. It was well-known in the ancient world as well. We have instances from the first century and other periods around the same time of people who knew that this sort of thing did happen. We see one of them hinted at in the book of Acts, where Peter has got out of jail, even though he was supposed to be killed the next day. And he comes and knocks on the door of the house where the disciples are praying, and the maid hears his voice and says to the others, it's Peter, it's Peter. And they say, it must be his angel, which means, oh, Herod's obviously had him killed, and this is one of those post-mortem visitations that we know happen from time to time. And then Peter goes on knocking at the door, and it turns out it really is him. He really is alive. So and this is the point. Had it been a hallucination of that sort, that doesn't mean that somebody is alive again. It means that they are bodily dead, and you better need to go and organize the funeral. Now, of course, that wasn't the case in Jesus' case. This is why I've often said you need to have, in order to explain the rise of the belief in the early church, you need to have not only appearances of the risen Jesus, but also the empty tomb. If you just had appearances, they would have gone and checked the tomb and found that his body was still there. If you just had people arriving at the tomb and finding it empty, they'd have probably said, oh, it's grave robbery or whatever. There are many other such theories, and as you say, I've gone through them, and others as well have gone through them. I mean, this is quite a common thing that apologists do. I don't always agree with how those apologists do it, but I'm thinking of people like Gary Habermas or William Lane Craig. They have analyzed all those skeptical arguments, and I have gone through the main ones in my big book on the resurrection.
Wright actually spends a lot more time on each of these objections in the full, unedited interview, including some that I didn't have time to get to here. If you want the whole thing, unedited, that's available in the premium feed, and you can get that in the show notes right now. Let's shift back to the Gospels real quick. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they don't always tell the same story the same way. And so some people point to those differences and say, look, they're unreliable, right? How do you respond to that?
If I walk up the street from here, I get to a newsagent where I buy my newspaper every morning. If I were to buy the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, the Sun, the Mail, all the others, and were to read the report on what just happened in Iran yesterday, or in Jerusalem this morning, or indeed in London or Washington, I would get very different accounts. It's notorious that when people are telling particularly first-hand eyewitness stories, they do come out differently. And after all, even in the New Testament itself, take the book of Acts, where 3 times we are given the story of Paul's conversion, if that's what it is, or his experience on the road to Damascus. We get it in chapter 9, and then we get it twice told by Paul himself towards the end of the book when he's telling people what happened to him. It comes out slightly differently each time. Does that mean it never happened? No. Does that mean that all storytelling involves selection and arrangement? Yep, it means exactly that. These are not photographic representations. These are not, if you had a video camera there, this is what you would see. Speaking as a historian, I know only too well, you can't possibly describe everything you see so that everyone else who was there at the same time would have seen the same thing. Police records say this the whole time. This person said it was a red car. That person said it was a blue car. This person said the cyclist came out of that side road. This person said it was a motorbike and it came out of that road. This is common coin. It doesn't mean that nothing happened. Or, as I've sometimes said, we all know that fake news exists, but that doesn't mean that there was no news. Something happened, otherwise nobody would be talking about it. Of course, there are 1 or 2 notorious bits and pieces. I mean, somebody pointed out ages ago, I haven't checked this out recently, that when in the Gospels Simon Peter is denying that he knows Jesus, and then the rooster, or the cock as we would say in Britain, crows a few times, if you line up all the different stories and say, how can they all fit together, you end up having the rooster crowing, I think, 9 times rather than 3 times, which is what none of the stories say, but you could just about harmonize them by doing that. Now, that doesn't bother me in the slightest. I believe very firmly that Peter was denying Jesus, and that at certain key points there was this scary noise.
Richard Bauckham makes a similar point in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. The variation between the Gospels is actually what you would expect, from independent witnesses to the same events. Perfect agreement would actually be more suspicious, not less. But okay, so Wright says the Gospels are reliable, and the resurrection evidence is strong. That still leaves a big question. Does any of this prove that Jesus was actually God? Because Wright makes a really important distinction here. The resurrection alone doesn't automatically prove divinity. So what does?
What do you think is the best evidence for Jesus being divine? And I grew up, I think, being taught that the resurrection is what demonstrates his divinity. But how Would you say that's the case? And if so, like, why is that the case? Why couldn't God have just raised
No.
a really good prophet without him actually being God?
You're absolutely right that predictions of the resurrection in the Hebrew Scriptures and expectations of the resurrection in Judean thinkers before Jesus don't say that if someone is raised from the dead, then they will be divine. You know, when the Maccabean martyrs say, as they're being killed in 2nd Maccabees 7, you can kill me, you can cut off my hands and tongue and everything else, because God is going to give them back to me in the resurrection. They don't say, therefore we will be divine.
Yeah.
What that means is, therefore we will be the true Israel, we will be the true Judeans. God will have demonstrated that we were in the right all along. So I think it's been a muddle in Christian apologetics to imagine that the resurrection means the divinity of Jesus.
So the resurrection alone doesn't prove that Jesus was God. But what does? Wright says you have to look at what Jesus himself was actually claiming, and he wasn't being obvious about it.
The different, rather odd things which he's reported to have said, and including the cryptic ones. And the cryptic ones are rather interesting, because when Jesus says, if you have ears, then you better listen, you only say that if you've just said something which is so explosive that you perhaps better not say it out on the street. You know, you hint at something. Jesus often says that. Why? Would people have made that up a generation or two later? No. When we look at what they were recording a generation or two later, they're very explicit about what they believe about Jesus. But I mean, obvious example, in Matthew 11, Jesus is talking about John the Baptist, and Jesus says about John the Baptist, if you have ears to hear, then he is Elijah who was to come. Now, what is that about? That's about the book of Malachi in the Old Testament, which predicts that before Yahweh himself turns up, which he's promised to do, but he hasn't done yet, then I will send Elijah the prophet in advance. So when Jesus says, actually, if you will accept it, he was Elijah who is to come, and if you've got ears, you better hear, he's making a huge claim about himself. And that fits with all sorts of other bits of evidence, like when he's riding into Jerusalem in Luke 19, and it's not sort of foregrounded exactly, it just comes out casually. Jesus declares the upcoming destruction of the city. He says, because you didn't know the time of your divine visitation, which is a direct allusion to the idea that God would one day come back in person. That's one of the great stories in the Old Testament, in Isaiah and Zechariah and Ezekiel, that after the exile, they build the temple, but the divine, glorious, shining presence hasn't come back yet. What will it look like when it does? Nobody quite knew. But Jesus seems to have based all he was doing on the belief that when Yahweh came back, it would look like a young Jewish prophet riding on a donkey in tears and going off into Jerusalem to do what had to be done. That is, of course, an enormous claim, an unexpected claim. No other would-be messiahs of the period make any such claim. Even Simeon ben Koziba, 100 years later, alias Bar Kokhba, though Rabbi Akiba claims him as the son of the star, and some later writers say maybe he was claiming to be in some sense divine, it doesn't look anything at all like what we have in the Gospels. So this is, of course, unique. And uniqueness is hard to quantify it at the distance of 2,000 years.
What strikes me about this is how subtle it is. Jesus never stands up and says, I am God, worship me. But he acts it out. He rides into Jerusalem the way Ezekiel and Zechariah said God himself would return. He weeps over the city the way only God has the right to do. And then the authorities kill him for it. The resurrection is what vindicated those claims.
They have no idea at that stage what that's going to mean, that they are going to be going off and getting killed and hurt and so on in order to announce him as the King and Lord under the nose of Caesar and everybody else. But that's how it works out. And so what the resurrection says. You see, so often I've heard the resurrection expounded in terms of, well, of course, Jesus died for our sins. That's the real thing. And then there was a kind of a get out of jail free card. And so God allowed him to become alive again and then took him off to heaven. And that gets misunderstood. I've heard sermons at funerals saying, as our Lord Jesus, having died, was raised to heaven, so we believe that our beloved sister or brother, whoever it is has now been raised to heaven. And I say, no, that's not the point. Think about Revelation 5. Jesus, the Lamb, who is the Lion, he suffered and died, not so that we might go to heaven and sit on clouds playing harps, but in order to make us the royal priesthood. That's a very interesting concept. Humans becoming genuine humans at last. So the humanity of Jesus, if you like, enables and launches a new humanity of those who are in him. Now, the idea that that could happen without the resurrection, I just don't see how that would work. No doubt you might find a clever way around it, but I just don't think it would. Just don't think it would make the sense that it does in the texts. I mean, it is one of these things. Again and again, I'll come back to this. It's like many things in ancient history, if you put this item in the middle of the picture, all the rest of the evidence converges, so that even if that seems very unlikely, you have to say, well, the picture really does make sense with that in the middle.
So let me just lay out what we've covered. We have women as the primary witness in a culture that didn't count their testimony. We have an empty tomb attested across independent sources. We have every skeptical alternative failing at some point to account for the full picture. We have gospels that vary in the same way that real eyewitnesses' accounts vary. And we have Jesus making veiled claims to divine identity that only the resurrection could vindicate. That's a cumulative case, and it's the kind of case that brought me back after years of walking away from all this. But it's not just an argument. Wright tells a story that I think shows why this matters beyond the history.
I remember sitting beside an aged aunt of mine who was a nun and who was a deeply believing person. She knew she was going to die within the next few months. And she said to me touchingly, she said, after all, it can't be any worse than this, can it? And I remember thinking, poor you, actually we're promised much better than this. So she went on her way joyfully and we sang resurrection hymns at her funeral and it was great.
That story really impacted me because if the resurrection is real, then it's not just this historical curiosity we have. It redefines what we mean by death, by hope, by what we're actually saved for. And what Wright says next about salvation is probably the most surprising thing in this entire conversation.
But salvation in the New Testament is about God rescuing the whole of creation from its present corruption and decay. This is Romans 8, which is the climax of Paul's great essay on salvation, if you like. And again, Romans has been so misunderstood because people have assumed that Romans 8 is all about going to heaven. Paul never mentions heaven in that whole chapter. What he mentions is that the creation will be set free from its slavery to decay to obtain the freedom that comes when God's children are glorified. And glorified there doesn't mean go to heaven. It means becoming genuine humans put in charge of God's world, as in Psalm 8, crowned with glory and honor, with all things put in subjection under their feet. That's the psalm Paul is tracking with at that point. This involves so much rethinking of normal Western traditions that I appreciate it's hard to get one's head around.
And Wright goes much deeper on this in the full conversation. We spent a long time on what the New Testament actually teaches about heaven, the intermediate state, and who gets saved. It's some of the best material from this interview. And if you want that complete, unedited version of this interview, that's available for premium members. You can get that in the show notes now. Here's what I keep coming back to. Christianity didn't ask people to take it on blind faith. Paul says to test it. Luke says, I investigated it. And the historical evidence, when you actually sit with it, is far stronger than most of us were ever told. That's what this show is all about. N.T. Wright's books on this include Surprised by Hope and God's Homecoming, and I would really recommend checking out both of those. Next time, we ask N.T. Wright, what happens after you die? And I promise the answer is not what you were taught in Sunday school. Thanks for listening to Faith Lab.